All right, this is Matthew Matt, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the Common Core Standards for Mathematics, and in particular what they say the big ideas are in third grade. So they talk about four critical areas for third grade mathematics. The first one is multiplication division. The second is area. They talk about introductory fraction concepts, and finally thinking about shapes. This video is about introductory fraction concepts. In the standards, the fractions really come in the first grade, and young kids can begin to work on early fraction concepts. But I'm just going to talk about a few of the big ideas I see as coming up in this grade. So we've got a common kind of problem to introduce fractions is a story where kids have to share something. So 4 friends are sharing 6 cookies equally. How much does each friend get? I'm going to show a couple different ways we can think about this and some of the big ideas this brings up. So a common strategy kids might use is to draw our 6 cookies and then to start sharing them with kids. And I want to highlight something about this problem, which is that there's no fractions in it. I don't have to introduce fractions. I don't have to talk about what a numerator and a denominator is or anything like that. I can just start with a story. It's the kind of situation most kids are familiar with, sharing food. So they can start, they'll deal out their first 4 cookies, and then they might get stuck because they don't have enough cookies for everybody. Probably by 3rd grade they can figure out what to do, but if not, a question like, have you ever had to share something with a friend or with a parent, and what did you do in that situation? And they might think about cutting it up or breaking it, or you could suggest cutting it up or breaking it. Is there a way we could cut these so that we could share them? So then we might cut them in half, and then we can deal them out to our 4 friends again. And this highlights that each person gets 1 whole cookie and 1 half cookie, which you might write as 1½ cookies. And it's nice to start with words because there's a lot of baggage in the 1/2 notation, but kids need to develop familiarity with both of them eventually. And so that's one way to think about this problem. I want to highlight a second strategy, which is that we might cut the cookies up in half right away, either because we anticipate that this 4 and 6 numbers are not going to work out together, and so we figure out that cutting in half will work. Or because a common strategy for kids is to cut things in half. Half is a nice fraction, and we might just do that from the beginning and see what happens. And then we can deal them out 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this highlights that each kid gets 3 of these pieces, or each friend gets 3 of these pieces. So a name for that is 3 halves, or symbolically we can write it as 3/2. But part of what this highlights is that we can think of 3 halves as 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2. And that's really how the standards want us thinking about these fractions, especially for fractions larger than 1, as just multiple copies of the unit fraction, the 1/2. All right, I'm going to show 2 more strategies, but not in as much detail. So like the first one, we might deal out our 4 cookies, but then instead of cutting in half, we might cut each cookie into fourths, so that each friend gets a piece out of each cookie. A name for this is 1 2/4, or 1 plus a fourth plus a fourth. And finally, we might cut them all in fourths right from the beginning because we know that everyone's going to get a piece out of each cookie that way. And a name for that is 6/4, which is 1/4 added to itself or multiplied by itself times 6. So we have these 4 strategies, and I know there's a lot on the screen here, but part of what this helps us see is that there are multiple different names for the same number or value, in this case, same amount of cookie. So we have 1½ is another name for 3 halves, which is another name for 1 2/4, which is another name for 6/4. These are all just different names or different ways of saying the same total amount. And that lets kids start thinking about equivalent fractions really early on and reasoning about what that means for there to be 2 different names for the same fraction without having to introduce any formulas or things like that. Now, a lot of fraction problems are about sharing food, but I do want to give a couple other examples. If kids have worked with art, with blocks of clay in art, you could make story problems about sharing blocks of clay as long as they're all the same size. We can imagine a garden or a yard and having to split it up among people who are sharing it, or putting different crops or flowers in different parts of it. We might have lengths of ribbon that we need to cut up for different purposes. We might have buckets or cups that are partially filled with water. But recipes, feeding animals, things like that are nice contexts that work really well. There might be other kinds of problems we ask after we've done some of that foundational work, like I'm going to feed my cat 1/3 of a cup of food every day for 5 days. how much food do I need. We might also ask about which fraction is larger. So I might give kids 1/3 and 3/4 and say, which one's larger, how do you know? We really want these to be based on reasoning. So, well, 1/3 is less than a half and 3/4 is bigger than a half. Or 1/3 and 1/4. And I know that a third is bigger, assuming they both have the same whole. I know a third is bigger because I had to cut it up into 3 pieces versus a fourth where I had to cut up into 4 pieces, so those pieces are going to be smaller. We don't want to have any kind of formulas or tricks or memorized strategies for how to do it, just reasoning about fractions and what we know about them.